Good evening, everyone, and welcome to a special conversation hosted by AIA East Bay on housing advocacy featuring YIMBY Action. I'm Jamie Matheron, co-chair of the AIA East Bay Young Architects and Emerging Professionals Knowledge Community. So imagine living in a community with abundant housing. Our guest tonight is working to make that happen. Leora Tanjuatco Ross is the National Organizing Director for YIMBY Action. She's formerly educated in architecture, but has been organizing for housing since 2014, when she realized that architecture is political. Before YIMBY Action, she worked at the Housing Leadership Council of San Mateo, where she focused on organizing people in support of affordable housing. Leora has also served as the president of the Peninsula Democratic Coalition, the oldest and largest Democratic club in Silicon Valley. When she's near surface level parking lots, she will point out that they could be homes to anyone within hearing distance. So welcome, Leora. It's great to talk with you tonight.
Sure. Thanks for having me, Jamie. I'm so excited to be here. I will say, I know that you all have very high standards for visual collateral and images. So I tried to do justice to my architectural background.
That's awesome. Thank you. So I'll just give a little brief introduction, and that's great. And you can get your slides started. That's fine. You can get your slides going. So when I met Leora earlier this year, YIMBY Action was being honored with an award by the Building Industry Association of the Bay Area. And she jokingly referred to herself as a recovering architect. And so I thought, well, that's kind of fun. And that would be a great guest to have that I think our membership would be interested in that architecture is political and how she went from her architectural education to a career in advocacy and policy. So I'd love to hear more about that. And then we will we'll hear a little bit about your background. We'll hear about the work that YIMBY Action does. We'll hear what we can all do to get more involved in housing policy, and then we'll open it up for questions. So why don't you get started with your presentation?
Thank you, Jamie. So the title of this is a little redundant since I know it's in my bio, but I wanted to start out with YIMBY Action is a club of people who think that the big part of the problem with housing affordability is that we don't have enough of it. So we get together to figure out how to persuade our elected officials to build more housing. So we have 48 chapters around the country and over 50,000 people in our club. This is a little bit more about me, but I am raising a family right now in multifamily housing, which at least the people who are involved in politics, they think that's like a pretty radical thing to do. You know, if you go to city council meetings and stuff, they say like, well, families don't want apartments. They don't want condos. They want these, you know, half-acre lots with these big homes. And we've lived here for the past 5 years, and it has been wonderful to have a community where we know our neighbors. There are paths in our complex that don't have cars on them, like the one you see. And it's a very wonderful place to have kids. And so part of my advocacy is sort of talking about how families can really benefit from multifamily housing and how it could actually be something that's desirable. I feel like a little bit of a hypocrite while I say this because I do have an update, and I told Jamie about it. 8 adults in my family actually just bought a half-acre lot in Walnut Creek. And that's because we want to build an ADU on it. And it also has 2 junior ADUs already built. And so at the end of it all, there will be 10 people living on this property. The 2 kids and some folks who are not pictured here, but this is my family, and the sort of improvements that we can make to this property are only possible because of the laws that YIMBY Action and our advocates passed actually in 2017 to allow ADUs on a lot of single family lots, and also to streamline that process a bit. So I'm excited. This literally, we just closed the day before yesterday. So this is like really new.
Congratulations. That's awesome.
Thank you. And yeah, I mean, it's sort of this weird story about how, we were the lowest bidder. Uh, and the reason why they picked us was because we were the only non-corporation bidding on this property. And so there are a lot of interesting questions about how many people would be able to take advantage of these new laws as like people and not as corporations. But after the like tiny units are built, the in-law units, these sort of opportunities for people to have access to communities that they never would have been able to otherwise is huge. The 6 people in this picture are the 6 people who are on the mortgage, and that is the only way we were able to afford this piece of land. So my personal story and sort of like a personal motivation for doing the advocacy that I do. I wanted to highlight and tell you all about how I was in architecture school at the University of Oregon. I went there to work for their energy studies laboratory. At the time in 2012, they were the #1 ranked architecture school in terms of sustainability. And so I was really concerned about climate change, really worried about the individual choices that we make and their impact on the greenhouse gas emissions and things like that. So I went to Oregon to try and learn how we could change our cities to be more efficient in our lives. And it was this throwaway comment that a client of one of my professors said. He was like, if you want to change things, like really change things, you should go into politics and you should not be in architecture. And obviously it stuck with me. And I was sort of wondering what the rest of my cohort was doing if they didn't want to change things. I was always interested in changing the status quo because I think because of my travels, to places like Japan and Europe and other places, I've realized that that there are especially different urban fabrics that are correlated with different qualities of life. And I wanted to bring my suburban American upbringing into something that looked and felt more like the European cities that I had visited and fallen in love with. So this was the turning point from turning me in from an architecture student to a potential organizer. And of course, when I got started in organizing, I realized that what was happening, at least in San Francisco, this picture is from the Board of Supervisors. Actually, it's from the Planning Commission in San Francisco, was that there were these meetings wherein people were making decisions about housing. I'm not sure if you all are familiar, but even after a project in San Francisco has been approved, you can appeal the building permit process. There's like a whole other process after the entitlements. And those generally happen in the middle of the day where, if you are working or you're honestly like a normal person who's not appealing building permits in San Francisco, you would never know about this. But this is an example. I started going to these hearings and started honestly like listening to people who were saying, we can't let my neighbor add a second story to their home, or we can't let them add this secondary unit because it's going to destroy everything. I was really radicalized at these meetings because it was people who were very outraged at the idea of, an apartment building being down the street from them, or or as I said, an extra story being added. And to me, this was really, it was really hard after having all of this background in architecture, like all of this schooling, to then listen to someone who didn't really know anything about architecture say like, oh yeah, we should change all of these 1-bedroom units into 3-bedroom units. Just looking at these plans, like a random person is saying that, and then to watch like the elected officials say like, oh yeah, we should do that. That was like a really hard pill for me to swallow. And as you all know, that happens, hopefully not too often, but sometimes it does happen. So this is where I got radicalized as a political operative, basically. So I did want to go into a little bit of YIMBY history. We were founded in 2014, so we haven't been around for that long. And I don't know if this slide is sort of controversial to you all. In some circles, it is really controversial. People argue the point, is our housing prices a result of a supply and demand mismatch? Do we simply just need to add more housing? And at YIMBY Action, for us, the answer is yes. We should add housing of all different kinds, except for maybe like single family homes and McMansions, but we should add all kinds of multifamily housing to all the neighborhoods that we can. The existing neighborhoods, not the sort of green field. And so, we have experts and a long history of people saying, this is a catastrophe. This is a shortage of monumental proportions. And one of the sort of data points that I use to talk about this is a graph of, the population in the United States since 1970. You'll see that it's just been steadily increasing. And this is a graph of the number of housing units built per year since 1970. And I think this is really familiar to architects, this kind of boom and bust of construction. You'll see in 2008, 2009, this really big decline in production of housing. And you'll also notice that we haven't really recovered. We have not gotten back to our level of building. We haven't even gotten halfway back. So it's really, for us, this is kind of the proof in the pudding. Like, we've been increasing our population and our production of housing has really fallen off. So, why have we not built as much housing in the past 20 years as we did in the 1970s? A lot of it is organized opposition from NIMBYs. And so what we decided to do was to organize people who are going to say yes. And so this is what we started in San Francisco and what we have now sort of moved around the country. I will say the pandemic really accelerated our growth in the rest of the country, because people did leave the Bay Area to go to Texas and South Carolina and Florida, Arizona. Arizona, for the first time, is really struggling with housing costs. And so, so there are people sort of around the country feeling this crunch of housing prices. So this is pretty basic. Like, we show up to say yes to new housing. We ask our folks to go to city council meetings, planning commission meetings. We explicitly tell them, like, not to nitpick the design or the affordability or, anything about it. Something we say a lot is, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, because many times we've seen projects get killed just because they're an eyesore, quote unquote, or this is not appropriate for this neighborhood, or some sort of other baseless accusation. So we have two arms, YIMBY Action, which is a political organizing group, and then YIMBY Law, which is our enforcement arm. And YIMBY Law sues cities who are not following state law. So YIMBY Action organizes to pass state laws that make it easier to build housing. We have noticed that, especially for the last 30 years, cities that have flouted state law or ignored it have not had any bad consequences. So that's why we started YIMBY Law, in order to say, all right, there's going to be consequences if you don't follow this law. So we have over 50,000 activists throughout the country who are doing this kind of work. And we have, as I said, 48 chapters in various states. And these chapters, as I said, organize to support specific housing projects. They also support state level housing policy. I'll talk more about that in California. And then also we support candidates who are vocally pro-housing and have voted in favor of development historically. We're a 501c4 on the YIMBY action side, so we can really get our hands dirty in elections. So wanted to share our California political priorities for this year. We have two big bills. One is SB 423, which is an extension of SB 35. I don't know if that like rings any bells or anyone knows what that is, but it is a streamlining bill. It says that cities who have not met their allocation for housing, if it's 50% affordable, then that housing is approved by right on sites that are zoned for housing. So just trying to cut the red tape for housing permits.
Is Mountain been warm? Flood warning continuing for the Merced River and a flood advisory.
Thanks. And then we're also pushing for SB4, which is trying to get more housing in affluent neighborhoods. A lot of affluent neighborhoods have churches that have these amazing parcels of land that are completely vacant 6 days out of the week, and on Sunday fill up fill up with the congregation. This law would say if a church as a landowner wants to build affordable housing on their lot, they can do so without going through the city council approval process, which would be a game changer for that. So we're excited about that one. Yeah, so I wanted to transition into, like, as architects, what can you do for housing as people? The big one is support new multifamily housing in your neighborhood. In the East Bay, the people who are making the decisions are the Planning Commission and the City Council. I'm sure you know. Wherever you live, look at the agendas, submit a comment. It can be as easy as taking 5 minutes to send an email. You can also call your city hall and submit your comment that way. But this is kind of the most impactful thing you can do, especially if you're in a smaller city. I always use this slide to point out that I met my husband doing YIMBY stuff. So it's a wonderful community. If you join as a member, we have a big Slack where you can introduce yourself and find like-minded people. There's about 4,000 people in there. And I wanted to point out that we have a local East Bay YIMBY chapter who are working at the state level, but I would say they were instrumental in getting Berkeley to consider studying their upzoning of Rockridge. Sorry, that's in Oakland, but there's a Berkeley community, adjacent to Rockridge that they really wanted to make sure it was more feasible to build more housing there. So they've been working on that. But of course, that's kind of the system, right? You get the elected officials to consider, to commit to a study, and then you sort of push for the zoning all the way through. So I invite you all to join this. If you join us via yimbyaction.org/join, you will immediately get connected to East Bay YIMBY. It's automation, the computer does that. But I also wanted to talk about, in your capacity as architects, we have services that you could take advantage as well. So if you have a project that you want YIMBY Action to support, we will support it no matter if you're a business member or not. I have the link, you can put it in our portal, and that's something we do because our members get so excited about new projects. So it's like a benefit for us to know about new projects. But also for certain projects, we offer legal support through YIMBY Law. The laws around housing are always changing, and it's kind of our fault. It's YIMBY Action's fault because we're trying to pass new laws all the time. But YIMBY Law provides sort of consulting. Like if you don't know if a new law applies to your site, or if you're not sure if what the city is doing is legal or not, you can get a consult from YIMBY Law and just kind of run it past them. The other thing that's valuable is as architects or developers, you can get in our Slack and just like say like, hey, our project is going to be a planning commission today. You know, here's what time, call in. We have a lot of very online organizers, activists. And so we do have a lot of developers and architects in the channel being like, hey, support my project. And yeah, then you have access to this other group of developers, contractors, elected officials, and activists who are also in the club. So that's if you join as a business member. I will put this link in the chat because this is really important. If you have projects you want us to support, put them in here and we will support them. If they're housing, that's basically, if they're multifamily housing, we've even supported like some ADUs, but yeah, we basically support everything that comes in through there. So yeah, that's my spiel.
Great. Thanks. Yeah. So I think before we get to we'll get to questions from the audience in a few minutes. But yeah, I think I appreciate that you shared about, your own personal home ownership journey. And I think that's what's interesting when we look at this issue as it affects young professionals, is that I've thought it throughout my own career, wow, I'm helping create housing for other people, and yet it's not attainable for me to become a homeowner quite yet. So I think that's something for me that makes it personal, and I'm sure for other people of our generation that we can really feel that. And are there some ways that you can think of to kind of spread that message to people? I know that sometimes I think when it becomes more personal, or people realize, wow, that affects my family members or my, adult children or those kind of things, it can change minds in some ways when people think, oh, we want to keep out any change and block any change from happening. So what do you think about those kind of ideas?
Yeah, I mean, you're exactly right. And when we talk to our activists, we really try to get them away from like the charts that I was showing you, because we have had an activist or two being like, look at this is a supply and demand curve, and that is not really persuasive to people who are really worried about change. So we are trying to like educate our own club about, okay, here's how you tell your story. Here's how to tell it in a way that's compelling. And we are also trying to partner with other groups to elevate the stories of their folks, people who aren't necessarily housing activists, but who have housing stories nonetheless that should be shared.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it was interesting that you brought up how you had that experience living in multifamily housing and with family. Are there some ways that you think that misconception can be dispelled for people? Like you discussed that people would say, oh, people don't want to raise children in a more dense community.
Yeah, I mean, I think the kind of unfortunate reality is that people like me who have kids are either rich or they are living in multifamily, already. So it's definitely, I mean, I think we could do more to highlight like families who are living in cities and whose kids don't ride in cars. And they, they'll take the bus, so they're like city kids. And I think the missing piece to that is actually like, families who live in the city have a much smaller carbon footprint than suburban families. And so we have a whole group called urban environmentalists who are working to like spread that specifically in the environmental community, because it's not really like embraced right now, the idea that density is good for the environment.
Right.
And so actually, because I'm moving to Walnut Creek in a couple of weeks, the local Sierra Club, there's like one mole we have in the Sierra Club who's like pro housing. He DM'd me today and was like, hey, can you join the Sierra Club in Walnut Creek and like try and get those people to be better on housing.
Yeah.
So we have like sort of, don't tell anybody, we have like a covert mission to try and connect those dots.
That's great. And I noticed on the website, I liked the way that it was sort of branded as like, yes to people, yes to housing, yes to more neighbors, yes to short commutes, yes to walkable communities. And I think that ties back into the sustainability kind of component that you're talking about. And you mentioned that as a kind of core of your architectural education, that you were focused on sustainability. And so I think that's another place, and I'm sure maybe you have some more ideas about this, but how that message and that misconception can be dispelled as well. Because I hear an objection is, oh, it's, more housing uses more water or something, but people living in dense housing use less water than, golf courses or something, for instance, that's using water for not any purpose of sustaining people. So do you see that as another kind of avenue of public education about how there can be greater sustainability and greater environmental impacts from keeping housing and keeping people in a more dense community than spreading out?
Totally, yeah. There was a really great New York Times article, maybe like 3 or 4 months ago, that was talking about the correlation between lower carbon footprints and denser housing. And I wish we could just like reprint it every week or so. Because I think we're starting to make headway. But this narrative of like greener, like wide open spaces being more green than urban spaces is really well entrenched. I was reading a Dr. Seuss book to my kid a couple of years ago, and I was like, what is this? It says like, there's this ideas of like, being out in nature is the most sustainable way to live. For most of us, that means being in the suburbs. And so I think we're going to keep chipping away at it for sure. But yeah, that's totally a piece that I think we need widespread narrative change on.
Yeah, that makes sense. And in the last few years, when we've seen some of the bills, you talked about the upcoming bills, and of course you have other bills that have passed in the last few years. So do you have kind of metrics, or how do you track that? Like, are those bills, causing change in the number of projects that get approved, or the streamlining aspects of the time that it takes for approvals to happen at the jurisdictional level?
Yeah, so somebody asked me, it was, I think, the San Jose Mercury, on the 1-year anniversary of SB 9 passing. So SB 9 was like the thing that let you lot split and build up to 4 units on a single lot. They called and they said, in this like 1 million person city, there have been 11 approvals of SB 9 lot splits in a year. And I think there were 25 more in the pipeline that had not yet been approved. So, about 35 over the course of 1 year. And, for us, we were like, well, that's a start, it's better than 0.
Yeah.
And then some of the NIMBYs were like, well, it doesn't do anything, so it doesn't really matter, but we should still stop it.
They're still against it.
Right? So, some kind of double speak there. But I mean, the frustrating reality is that things are moving slower than we want them to, especially when the need is so dire. And like tonight, people are sleeping in their cars and sleeping in tents on the street. And so that is a sort of frustrating reality with all of this, for sure.
Yeah. And in terms of those bills, do you think are the bills getting modified in a way that where they're not effective enough, or is there a lack of awareness that the bills have passed, or do you see other kind of structural impediments to having them have the intended effect?
Yeah, I mean, we're trying to have everything that we pass and that we support be streamlining. The legislature last session passed 4,000 bills. That is a shit ton of bills, especially for the poor planners who need to like decide how their projects in the pipeline are going to be handled by the new legislation and that sort of thing. So we sort of have like, it's an informal policy, but like we try to say, okay, with this bill, we're trying to like negate these other 5 bills or something,
Okay. Yeah.
So, like certain things, we're supporting a CEQA exemption bill, for 100% affordable.
Mhm.
Like that is in the spirit of what we want to do. So we're trying to, I think California politically is incredibly progressive, and progressivism has equated to more laws.
Mhm.
And I don't think we are going to turn around anytime soon and stop passing laws.
Right. So are you saying that the new laws, there's kind of this juggernaut of existing laws. So any of these new laws, it's going to take a while for them to kind of chip away at the ways that things have gotten entrenched that end up preventing housing or stopping the quick approval of any housing.
Yeah. And also, like, laws, as you know, have unintended consequences. And so, like, we're just going to we're obviously going to listen to the experts on what are the good laws, what we really do take our cues from developers and, lawyers, people who know this, to say, like, okay, what do we support? What makes sense? Because there are a lot of activists who are like, I know what to do. And, they've never built a house before or like enforced a law before. So we really defer to the experts. And then, once the experts are like, okay, here are the laws that are important, that are good, we can go to our group and be like, all right, here's why we want to prioritize these particular laws.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, I think we could open it up to questions. All right, let's see if there's any questions in the chat. I know there was a question about getting the slides. So if you'd like to raise your hand, then we can call on you for a question, or you may type your question in the chat. So what do our attendees, what questions do we have for Leora? Okay, there's a question in the chat that says, we have projects with market rate developers, and it seems like all they care about is money. What are the best points to help sway market rate developers to actually provide some affordable, equitable housing? What are the California housing incentive laws for developers?
Yeah, I would say the biggest one is state density bonus. And I'm not sure if, actually, I don't know if it incentivizes affordable housing.
Yeah, I think it
Yeah.
does. I think if you provide some affordable housing, then you're able to exceed the density that would be prescribed by zoning.
Okay, good. Thank you. And I think, SB 35 tries to do this as well, where it says, you can get these exemptions if you're 50% affordable. And, talking about unintended consequences, we had in Cupertino, there's a project where it was going to be more overall units, but then they decided to use SB 35. And then they said, well, we need 50% of them to be affordable. So they shrunk the number of units altogether, added a bunch more office. And so what was approved was ultimately more affordable units, fewer units overall, which is a trade-off, So there are laws like that the developers should be inputting into their spreadsheets, and then kind of making those profit and loss tables. Nikki, we like at YIMBY Action, we joke that developers are just walking, talking spreadsheets. And we know that all they care about is money. And that is because they need financing from banks, and they need to be able to show their numbers. And so, yeah, you're right. They care about money. I guess we just don't hold it against them because there are these huge construction loans that they need.
Right, that's a great point. And to that idea also, affordable housing doesn't cost less really to build, right? A unit costs a lot. And so when those units are made affordable, if they were sold for less, then either that needs to be made up from some kind of other funding, some matching funds or something like that, a governmental funding, or the other units need to be more expensive to offset the cost of those less expensive units, right? So I think it is an interesting calculus of how that all comes together, that getting, it has to be made up somewhere, and there really isn't a way to build something. Of course, there are slight differences in the degree of finishes and things that can be put into a unit, but that's really minuscule in terms of the fees for approvals. The governmental permit fees and all those things are really astronomical, and labor and materials and all that stuff adds up so much that the units just are expensive. And so that money does have to come from somewhere to make anything make sense. And of course, home builders and developers are in the business of providing homes, and they, typically they care about also providing homes and the value that that brings to society. But at the end of the day, it is also a business. And I think that's what's interesting. We don't necessarily begrudge people who produce and sell other things in the same way. That I think there can be this thought about developers being about money, but when you buy anything else, there's a profit, there's the cost that went into producing that item, and that this is something that we all need to live in a home. Hopefully everyone, we get to the point where everyone has a home to live in. And so I think it's not necessarily that they are only caring about money, but like you say, that they're a piece of this puzzle with the financing, with the banks, with all that, with the labor and materials and governmental fees, and it all comes together to be something that is quite expensive to produce. All right, another question is, let me scroll up here. Promoting higher density is necessary to overcome the idea that nature is a more healthy way of living. Suburbia is not sustainable. Yeah, more of a comment, but.
Thanks, Jose.
Yeah.
Amen.
What about the housing elements? How come the state of California is not enforcing cities not actually building housing units? What are the consequences for cities who are not holding to their housing element? And you covered this a little bit with YIMBY law, but maybe you can talk a bit more about what happens there.
Yeah, so we filed 12 lawsuits against mostly Bay Area cities for not meeting their deadlines for the housing element, or like Sausalito, putting some underwater sites in their site inventory. It is like this is the question of the moment. What's going to happen to these cities? Nobody knows, because these laws are new, and the laws do have some contradictory elements in them. They need to be interpreted by a judge. And so, we are arguing that cities had plenty of time to produce these, that, various arguments, because I know, like Palo Alto, for example, their defense was, given the turnaround times from HCD, it wasn't feasible for us to meet the deadlines. Those are the kinds of like back and forth arguments that we're engaged in and will be engaged in as these cases go to either settlement or trial or something. There are several cities that have settled with us or our allies already. And what we have asked for in the settlement is like a signed sort of document saying that the builder's remedy applies and that they will comply with that, which means that they cannot use their zoning to deny projects. So that's what's going on with housing elements.
Then Remy asks, some planning departments are using multiple pre-app meetings to prevent SB 35 projects from getting expedited, as the clock doesn't start ticking until the planning application is submitted. What is being done to prevent this pre-app requirement, many of which are permit CD level items? So maybe they're asking for some things that typically we wouldn't provide in the drawings until the construction document phase, but they might be asking for a lot of extra stuff up front.
Yeah, I don't know. Do we need another law for this? I don't have a good answer to this, because I appreciate you bringing this to our attention. And I mean, I know there's certain things like, the 5 hearing rule and things like that that have been put in place because cities were doing stuff like this, or
Mhm.
just unlimited hearings.
Yeah. And then there's a comment, I like this idea that laws have unintended consequences. There was a recent 99% invisible talking about LA where parking minimums were instituted. This law eliminated and very successfully medium density housing type because the parking requirement made it impossible to build, helping to create a housing issue. Are there examples of recently supported housing laws that have negative effects that were unintended? So any of these recent bills that you can think of that are doing something that you wish they weren't.
So inclusionary zoning, it's statewide, right? In California, there are some states that don't have it at all. I've heard from market rate developers that it stalled their production for about 5 years. So I think that that's a really big example of a sort of well-intended law that wasn't very successful, at least not in helping us increase our housing supply overall. The other thing is that, for inclusionary zoning, the AMI levels, to get very nerdy, but, the area median income levels are usually high, 80%, 100%. I was talking to a developer who said that, like, saying that they could do 10% of their units at 120% AMI made the project more politically palatable to the politicians, because they could say, oh yes, it's 10% affordable or whatever. But when you have a unit that's going for 120% AMI, there's a stack of paperwork this big that you need to fill out in order to verify your income. And you need to do it every year. And the problem with the units, the inclusionary units that are so close to market rate, is that tenants are like, well, I could pay a pretty similar cost for a market rate apartment that doesn't require all this paperwork. And so, this distinction of below market rate versus market rate is not as clear as we like to think. And I do think that inclusionary zoning has been it's had a negative impact on our housing supply.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I think that you had some questions for us. So would you like to do that?
Yeah, I wanted to get y'all's sort of input on how objective standards could be good or bad for, like, your design processes. It's something that we really support because we do not like it when the process is really unpredictable, or like random people can, like, if it's discretionary or subjective,
Right.
like it adds cost, it's unclear. And so, right now it's state law. All of your design standards need to be objective. However, there are hundreds of cities in California who are not following that.
Mhm. Yeah, well, in my experience, and then we can open it up if anyone else wants to speak to it as well. But yeah, I think that the objective standards are so much better because I observe the process at the planning commission or city council level, and those elected officials, they understand what their role is. And so I think they can be most successful when their role is kind of defined, and we are evaluating this project against these standards. And they're not always architects or design professionals also. So they hear from the public, and often the public has the kind of sentiments that you talked about, that's very, organized opposition to it, or sort of reactionary fear of change. So they express themselves. And, I noticed that the elected officials, want to kind of validate what the people are saying and hear them and respect their opinions. But then ultimately, if there are standards that are established that says, okay, we're just evaluating you, our role in this hearing is to evaluate this project against these zoning guidelines, and this project does meet them. So therefore, while I hear, to the community member, I hear your concerns, but I basically must vote to approve this project because it does meet these standards. And I think that some of the work you're doing in general, just the general sentiment about the housing crisis, it has seeped in. I've just noticed, little comments from elected officials, that they're more aware, I feel, of this crisis than they were a few years ago. So I think that helps as well. But ultimately, they come down to, looking at their role is to compare the project to standards, and it really helps them do their job in a more logical way. Would anyone
Or
else?
like our
Yeah.
secret dream is that AI can do plan check
Yeah.
in the future.
Yeah.
I said that to my friend who's a planner, and she was like, no.
Yeah. Yeah, it is interesting that what that could do to professionals and to their roles, if it takes over some of the things that people do. But still, I think in design, for sure, there's the human aspect of understanding how things come together that AI is not going to supersede.
Right.
And there was Remy, would you like to speak to your comment? You can unmute yourself if you'd like to.
Yeah, I just had a comment about these inclusionary zoning units. They don't get any affordable housing money, so that makes them very difficult to build. And usually developers have to raise the price of the remaining units to cover the cost of those inclusionary units. So, we usually like to see a project big enough that you could carve out an entire parcel for affordable housing. And I've seen some projects be able to pencil out that way. I think recently in San Francisco was that kind of twisty building. Well, I can't remember what it's called. The one with kind of the twisty facade.
The
Is that a
Mira.
David Baker? It might be a David Baker.
No,
The
no, it's that.
Mira by Studio Gang.
Oh,
Yeah, the
oh,
gang
that one,
project.
yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Where they actually parceled out a whole section
Mm,
of the building as affordable housing, and they were able to get funding versus the normal ways, putting units in the building. And it's made worse in San Francisco because you have to spread the units throughout the tower, so you're giving up some premium space for those affordable units. So again, that reduces the profit for the developer, and they have to raise the price of everything else to make that guy pencil.
mhm.
So it's very problematic, and I think a little more flexibility in allowing developers to carve up their projects so they can take advantage of these affordable housing funds. Will go a long way to getting more housing built over. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Remy. Would anyone else like to speak to this item? All right. Leora, did you have other questions for us?
Yeah, I guess, what can we as activists who are always pushing for new laws, what can we do to make your guys' jobs easier?
It's a great question. Yeah, I think that I liked how you talked about that YIMBY law was available if we wanted to say, hey, does this apply to our project? Because, sometimes firms will have in-house experts that will kind of help, stay abreast of all these new laws and help us, apply, or know when they can be applied. Because yeah, for developers, for architects, for everyone involved, it can be challenging to keep up with all the latest things and make sure that we are using the right application processes and everything. So I think that kind of outreach to the design community can be valuable for us to know what these laws kind of allow us to do, and the opportunities that they provide.
Nice.
And Remy, would you like to speak to that also?
This whole idea with objective standards, I think, is really great. There's too many design reviews that are required nowadays, and it's totally subjective. And, people, making developers do things that, really, increases the cost of housing and delays the process. So, all for objective standards. And, I think, better yet, if there are objective standards and the project meets those, they should just go directly to the building department and not have to go through a planning commission hearing and, deal with the neighbors and the planning commission and potentially city council or board of soups and just go right. And then it makes the job of the planning department easier. They just check, make sure that that project meets it. And, it's part of the, I guess they call it multi-department plan check that you normally do, where fire and, public works and then everybody checks the project. So I'm not sure what one of those SBs or ABs are addressing that, but that's the biggest one that would help. And New York City has that. You can imagine, huge dense city like that. And I've had a developer that I worked with who couldn't believe how Byzantine the project, process was in San Francisco, where, we had about 10 lawyers and, consultants sitting in a hearing, planning commission hearing behind a whole bunch of garage additions that had to go through planning. And, we were burning probably $10,000 an hour. He wasn't happy about that.
Wow.
And of course, the meeting got late and our project got tabled.
Yeah.
So.
I mean, your dreams are our dreams in this regard. I spoke at a planning convention a couple of weeks ago and, started to talk about how planning should happen at the plan level. All of the community input should happen at the level where you could solve the problems that people bring to you, like traffic or water rights or schools, overcrowding, that sort of thing. All of that discussion should not be happening at the project level. Doesn't make sense. Of course, that's very controversial.
Thank
Say
you.
to answer your question, also just SQL reform would be amazing, which I know you guys are sure on. And just quickly, just making the process quicker of getting through planning. And so maybe this is objective things that does that, but just overall, I know like Oakland used to be the fast one, and now they're coming close to San Francisco in length of permitting. There's lack of staff that you can't do anything about, but anything just to reduce the time it takes to go from design to ready to build, to make that it's very costly for the developers, and it's hard for staffing of firms. It's just overall, it's bad overall. So those are maybe my two things that seem important that you guys can attack.
Yeah,
Thanks, Brian.
I'm so happy that there's not any answers from like left field. I think we're all on the same page, which is great. Just checking my homework.
That is great.
Actually, I'd like to bring up with Brian. I did have a project in Oakland, and it was, I think, it was a duplex with a couple of ADUs. Pretty simple. It's in the flats, in actually an economically depressed area. And that guy sat. I think, gosh, we went in October. They finally responded to us in late April, saying, "Oh, okay, they've assigned it to a planner." And of course, they blamed the hack, when the city department got hacked, which is totally BS. It had nothing to do with really the hack. It's just that they're, they're probably understaffed, and I don't understand why it would take 8 months to assign a planner to a project to even look at it, and then it goes back in queue for another 2 months, and then it says on the website, oh, it takes 8 to 12 months. Just to go through planning. I mean, for a duplex.
That can make it really hard on home builders too, going back to our idea about the financing and everything, because now they have this financing extended for this lengthy time that they weren't anticipating. So that probably just makes projects not even get started, because people realize, wow, this could be a very painful process in terms of the money that would need to be extended to even start a project.
Yeah, and it changed the interest rate environment on that project. I mean, when it was being planned, interest rates were 2 to 3%. Now it's 7%. Unfortunately for this developer, I think he owns the property already, and he's using his own labor. But I could see for any other developer who's not as fortunate, that project just went from feasible to infeasible. And another thing, actually, a lot of times you get a planning approval, and because the environmental economic environment change, you know, went from, you know, like the interest rate rise, the builder can't build it. But yet then, you know, he gets to a point that his planning approval expires. So all the years of money he spent on planning now goes to naught because it expired and you start from scratch. So that's a big problem.
Great feedback. Thank you.
What's your take? What's YIMBY's take on redevelopment agencies? You know, they got deteriorated. They had amazing effects on certain districts in California. San Francisco was a very powerful one that has produced amazing work now. And you know, see Trans Bay building out. That all happened because of that. And then when Jerry Brown got rid of them, San Francisco's kind of held on to it as their own little thing, right? They just made it OCI, which is kind of similar organization, but I think other cities probably could benefit. Oakland could definitely benefit, I think, from redevelopment coming back. What's going on with that?
Yeah, we support, you know, the reinstatement of redevelopment agencies. Would that happen at the state level? Do you know? Or would it have to
Yeah,
be
because Jerry
city to
Brown is
city?
the one who voted it out.
Yeah.
So yeah, it would be a state level thing.
Yeah, I wonder why we haven't worked on that yet. It must be like a political landmine, like CEQA reform.
Well, I remember Jerry Brown got rid of it
Mhm.
so he can pull the money that was allocated to redevelopment out and put it back in the general fund.
Right.
So, you know, as Brian mentioned, the city, you know, said, oh, we'll create this OACI or whatever, Office of Community Development. But that money, you know, they lost the state funding. So that's a big problem because a lot of that state funding actually went into the affordable components of these big redevelopment projects. Because again, affordable housing costs $1 million per unit to build. So there's no way that's ever affordable unless it's got some heavy subsidies.
Yeah,
So-
a question for you guys is I've seen some crazy figures on like unit counts for affordable housing, like $700,000 a door, all the way up to like $900,000 a door. Why is that so much more expensive than like an ADU, which is, you know, maybe 250 or
I think those
something?
figures are a little misleading because those numbers that they publish included all the development costs of the nonprofit. So like if you take that versus a market rate housing project, I don't think it's apples to apples, those numbers that the developers are producing. But yes, it is. It's always thought about as being at least in San Francisco, as much as expensive as a market rate project, and usually a little bit more. And what we've been thinking about in this, we're doing several of these affordable bigger projects, is there's so many more units on the sites because the units are smaller. So you have more plumbing fixtures, you have more kitchens, you have more, you know, it's just like all that stuff. There is just more of it, more mechanical systems. So that's part of it. They also always have a lot of community services on sites. So offices to help out, you know, formerly homeless people or formerly unhoused people. So there's all these community services that a market rate project wouldn't have. Community rooms that can accommodate the whole building, you know, all the occupants, they can gather for holiday dinners. So like all those things add up. And then lastly, what's interesting is that the affordable projects is that they get money up front from tax credits, but long term they have a very fixed income. So they really want like really durable surfaces. Like, so the materials, they don't have money to maintain the buildings long term. So there's a level of quality that is kind of embedded into it about durability, which also has a cost associated with it. So that's been our kind of internal analysis of why we're seeing that.
Yeah, the numbers are just insane.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Well, thank you for everyone for your participation. It's been a really great dynamic conversation. Leora, do you have any last words for us or any last things you'd like to encourage us to do? I appreciate that you talked before about how we could join your organization and participate in the Slack channel and participate in public hearings. So anything else that you would like to leave us with?
No, I mean, I would love to follow up with maybe Jamie, I'll just send you the email that I want to send to everyone.
Okay, sure.
And I'll send the slides.
Okay, fantastic. Well, thank you. It's been very informative and wonderful to learn about the work that you're doing. And, hopefully there's a lot of good coming out of your organization and the bills and everything. And we know it's a big challenge, statewide. And as you mentioned, I appreciate that you mentioned that it's kind of going nationwide and those in a lot of other states as well. So it'll be fun to watch the progress that YIMBY Action keeps making over the years. As you mentioned, that was news to me that it's only been around for less than 10 years. So thank you for the work that you do, and we'll look forward to seeing more in the future.
Thank you so much for having me. This is wonderful.
Thank you. All right. Good night, everyone. Thanks for joining.